Hey guys, just out here doing some squirrel hunting before the season ends. I was tagged by Neil, the Briar Goat Killer, to do a video response, Meet the Bushcrafter. If you don't know what that is, there's a thing going around on YouTube that was, I believe, started by Mr. Cornfed80 down in East Texas, just to for people to really just introduce themselves to the YouTube community, the bushcraft community, and tell a little bit about how they got started into it, and also what their username means. So we'll get right to it. I'm Roosevelt. I think I'll just start because really for me it was my family that got me into it. So I'm going to start at the beginning, and hopefully it won't take too long here. I was born in a big city in Kentucky. We lived in a high-rise apartment building for 1 month, and from there I believe we moved to Indiana. I'm not sure, I don't remember, I was a baby. And we probably didn't live there very long until we moved to Michigan, southeast Michigan, which is where I live now. And I remember as a little kid, my dad had a whole bunch of chickens that we raised, and we had fresh eggs every day. We had fresh chicken probably every other day, and I believe we had other farm animals. We had a pet raccoon, we had a pet fox. My dad raised coon dogs, and I believe he even raised rabbit dogs. So hunting was a big part of what got me into it. And we lived there at the edge of a cornfield in an old farmhouse for probably a couple years. And I believe my dad got sick of the city life. Even though we were in a pretty rural farming community, it didn't suit him, and he wanted to move back down home. So we went back to Kentucky, probably around the age of 3, and we lived down there. I remember my dad planting a bunch of fruit trees in the yard and digging out a big hole in the creek that ran by our house so that we'd have a place to swim. He ran his own sewage system. My dad was really a do-it-yourselfer. He did everything himself for the most part. And my mom was a homemaker, so she made a lot of crafts and stuff at home, and cooked and all that stuff. For me, bushcraft is a somewhat new term. It's not new anymore. A lot of people use it. I think it's somewhat of an all-encompassing term. But I try not to get hung up too much on labeling things. And I'll just say that for me, what it is it's being self-reliant and doing more with less, and having knowledge in your brain of how to get things done without having to rely on someone else for it. Now, going back a little bit, when we lived up here in Michigan on that farm, I remember my dad and my uncles going out to the woods and coming back in the spring with literally bushel baskets chock full of huge yellow morel mushrooms. And I can still remember the taste to this day, 35, 40 years later. And I also remember them all going out hunting and bringing back animals and stuff to eat. And then once we moved back down home, my dad, he was really, really busy, and he didn't really have any time for us because he was always working. He was a coal miner and a welder, and he even got caught bootlegging. Except he wasn't a bootlegger. He was the guy that did the brazing and welding to make the stills and stuff. But he somehow got caught up in it. And I don't know, that's part of the do-it-yourselfer thing, you know. They even made their own alcohol. Uh, so, I don't know, a couple years went by. I had a little brother who was a brat, a little red-headed brat. And I thought he was always getting me in trouble. And at the age of 5, my dad finally decided that I could have a gun, which it wasn't a real gun per se, but it was the stereotypical Red Ryder Daisy BB gun. You know, the one you're going to shoot your eye out with in the movie The Christmas Story or whatever it's called. And he trained me all about gun safety, you know, probably at the age of 4 or 5, and I had to prove myself before I was ever let have that gun. And sure enough, though, I was out one day and I sat that gun down on one of those pear or apple trees that he planted, and I went to check my target, and by the time I come back, my little brother had grabbed up that gun, and I can just remember my dad telling me, whatever you do, don't let your little brother get a hold of that gun. So now my brother has the gun, and I'm like, you gotta give that gun back. And of course, he's a little brat, he wouldn't do it, and he ended up whacking me right over the head with that gun, and it put a dent in the barrel. That's how hard he hit me with it. So, you know, I went in and told my mom. My dad was at work, and sure enough, when my dad come home, the first thing he did is beat my ass, because he told me you weren't supposed to let him get a hold of that gun, and I don't care that he hit you over the head with it. It's your fault because you weren't supposed to let him get a hold of it. So not only did I get whacked over the head, I got my ass beat too. So that kind of instilled gun safety into me. And it was about a year after that my dad died of heart failure. And we lived down there until I was 8 years old, and my mom's family all lived up here in Michigan, so we come back to Michigan where she could be with her family and people that she knew. And that was pretty much it. You know, that kind of ended the whole hunting and fishing and all that farming and homesteading type stuff, and I really missed it. I had another uncle who later in life I had met him, and we started hanging out doing some salmon fishing and stuff together. He told me about how he grew up. They were real poor, living down in Louisiana, and they actually lived in a cave. He said he was a caveman, kind of jokingly, but he really was. They lived in a cave, his whole family, and there was no work down there either. And one nice thing about moving up here, though, is when we lived in Kentucky, there was no such thing as Cub Scouts. They were trying to get it going down there, but there just wasn't enough interest or money to make it happen. And once we moved back up here, when I was 8 years old, Cub Scouts was up and running, so I joined right up because I love that stuff. You know, I love working with my hands and doing stuff in the outdoors. So I joined Cub Scouts and went through all that. I went through Webelos, and I wanted to go into Boy Scouts because that's where you were really going to get into the real outdoors, survival, bushcraft type stuff. But we just didn't have enough money. There was a big trip you had to go on to Colorado or somewhere, and it cost about $1,500, and you couldn't join if you couldn't make that trip, and so I couldn't join because we certainly didn't have $1,500 to do it. But I did get the Boy Scout of America handbook, and I decided that, you know, I'm not going to let this stop me from doing the things I like, being poor or whatever, and or not having anybody to help me. So I just went through that whole Boy Scout book, and I learned all those skills myself. I taught them all to myself. Me and my cousins, we all did it together. Plus we started hunting once I was around the age of 10. I started hunting small game, and took my dad's 22 out and started hunting with that, and I felt a real connection, you know, to my dad from that experience of hunting and actually getting out in the woods with the rifle that he used to go hunting. And really for me, it really is like the hunting and the fishing is a large part of what bushcraft is about to me. I think that's how it got started. I'm not really familiar with the term bushcraft. I know a lot of other guys have said it, but really there was no term for it. You just hunted and you fished and you trapped, and all the stuff you did to make that happen, whether it was cooking over a campfire or rigging up something out of wood for a trap set or a stringer for fish or whatever it may be, that was bushcraft. Pretty much all my uncles on my mom's side were in the war. Well, a couple were in Vietnam, Korea, World War II, and they had a lot of stories to tell about that. So I don't know, that kind of put me in touch with being self-reliant again, and depending on yourself and the people around you to get you through a bad situation or whatever. But we got up here and I was in Cub Scouts and I did the whole Boy Scout thing on my own, and then I met up with my one cousin who had his dad, my uncle, lived in the same house that we did when we lived up here way back when, on that farm near that cornfield. And he had the whole homestead down. He had rare pheasants from China. He had chickens. He had pigs. I think he even had a cow and maybe a horse. All kinds of stuff. Rabbits. He raised rabbits. And it was getting close to the time where I could go deer hunting. I believe you had to be 12 years old, but somehow I managed to be able to go deer hunting at the age of 10. They sold me a license. And the problem is, I didn't have a gun for deer hunting. All I had was that 22 and my dad's old 16 gauge Ivor Johnson, which was pretty well worn out. So I worked out a deal with my uncle that I would help him and my cousin on his farm shoveling pig shit and a variety of other farm chores, basically barter and trade for a youth model Winchester 20 gauge break action. And so I worked all summer for him. It really wasn't bad work. I enjoyed it. I mean, I loved working on the farm, and I got to learn a lot of things from him. He was into flintlock rifles and bow and arrow hunting, so I sort of started getting that primitive feel, like I wanted to go back in time, and hunt with a flintlock, and I wanted to hunt with a bow and arrow because it just seemed more challenging and more raw and more in touch with nature, I believe, was the real draw. So sure enough, I worked for him to earn that shotgun, and I got to go up north for my first time deer hunting. We had a big old deer camp with a big tent and a pop-up camper. My papaw, which is my grandfather on my dad's side from down south, we call him Papaw and Mamaw, and then several of my uncles, several of my older cousins, and some of my younger cousins too. There was probably a good 10 of us up there. And I got to shoot at my first deer, a big doe. It was running flat out full speed broadside, and I took a shot, which, these days I'd know better than to try and take a shot like that. But I was only 10 years old, and I shot and missed. And the very next day, my uncle shot a nice buck. He shot a doe, and he used my doe permit to tag the deer. And then the very next day, he shot a buck. And I remember my other uncle getting all upset and wanting to go home because obviously his brother showed him up. And what's funny about that is my other uncle had a pretty high-end Remington. As far as Remington goes, it was a high-end Remington 30-06 with I don't know, all the brass inlays or whatever and fancy etchings on it and stuff. And he was bragging so much about that rifle, but he couldn't get a deer. So that kind of instilled in me that you can, I don't know, the do more with less mentality. You know, you can't buy experience, you have to earn it. My uncle that got the 2 deer used a 303 British army rifle, military army rifle, and it worked just fine for taking those deer. My other uncle had a M1 Garand, and I think my papa had a 35 lever action. And so it was real neat seeing all those guns and being up there with all my uncles and stuff and hearing all the stories about the way they used to live and stuff, because my dad grew up in the South. They were poor, they lived in the hills, you know, or whatever. They didn't have much money, so they had to make things themselves and barter and trade for a living, because there wasn't really no work down there. And my mom, she grew up in the Depression here in Michigan, and her father, my grandpa, he delivered all 11 kids. They had a big family. He delivered all 11 kids and raised them up, and he had a bunch of books on medicine and stuff, and he was kind of like the family doctor. And he hunted and trapped as well for a living, and plus he was a stonemason, so he worked with his hands doing stonemasonry. And I don't know, it's really my family that got me into bushcraft. The whole idea behind that is just being self-reliant, doing more with less, and working with your hands. You know, I get a lot of good feeling out of making something with my own 2 hands, and I get even more appreciation for it by figuring it out for myself. And I think a lot of that was due to my uncle Stace, helping him on that farm with his pigs and stuff, and my dad and uncles, seeing them bring in those boatloads of morel mushrooms and raccoons and everything else. And that little raccoon, that pet raccoon we had, that I think that kind of put me more in touch with nature, because I have a real respect for nature and all the animals. You know, I am a hunter. I kill animals and I eat them, but I do it for food, not so much for the sport. I have fun doing it. I enjoy the chase and everything, but for me, you know, it's not about the kill. It's about getting out and enjoying nature and having fun, and more importantly, eating what I kill. Now I have one other uncle I want to tell you about. His name was Claude. He's no longer around, but you know, I grew up, once my dad died at the age of 5, I didn't really have a father figure around other than my uncles, and you know, they didn't have much time for me because they had their own kids to raise. But I had met Uncle Claude. He was my aunt's on my mom's side. It was her husband, and he was big time into fishing, and he worked for the sand and gravel company, so he had access to all the gravel pit lakes around here, and they stock all those pits with a lot of good fish. So if you have access, you can get in there and do some really good fishing. And up until that point, I was probably around 10 years old again, maybe 10, 12, 13, and all I had ever caught was little bitty bluegills and stuff with my cousin, and little black and brown bullheads over at the pond. And he took me out one day in his fishing boat on one of them gravel pits, and we used some Rapala floating minnow lures, and we was casting into the bank and just catching bass after bass after bass, big old largemouth bass. And I got a picture somewhere of me holding up a big old stringer of bass, And I thought that was the greatest thing. I remember catching a 10-inch bass, and that was the biggest fish of my life at that point in time. And before that day was over with, we'd caught probably 30 or 40, and they was all the way up to probably 18 inches. So I hadn't seen him for a while. They moved up north to Mile, Michigan. They had a cabin up there where he retired to, and there's some rivers up there that the salmon come in on the fall. In the fall of the year, the salmon come in from the Great Lakes, and you can go down there and fish for them. And he invited me to go with him, and we took this big old trek for about an hour and a half through the woods, driving up and down old country roads and stuff, and we finally got to the dam. That was the Foot Dam up north on the Au Sable River. And we got there. It was night, it was dark, it was raining, we had raincoats. We went down to the water, and I swear, I think it was the first cast I hooked into a big old salmon. Never had a fish on like that in my life. Again, you know, the biggest fish I'd ever caught in my lifetime. And that thing was buzzing out line. My drag was just screaming on my reel. And it took out every bit of line I had, and it tugged 3 times, and it snapped, and it took every bit of line off my reel with it downriver. And that rod came flying back and whacked me square between the eyes, and just about knocked me out. But we kept fishing through that night, and once again, you know, we ended up with a huge stringer of salmon. I think we had 6 salmon. We limited out 3 apiece, and they were anywhere from 36 to 40 inches long. And he took me back, and he showed me how to flay them up and stuff, and I got into that, and it was a real good time. And I did a lot of salmon fishing after that. We were sitting there talking one day, and he was out in his garage showing me all the old stuff he had, and he had some old zip reels. And that's what people these days call the yo-yo reel. It's like a spring-loaded reel with some line, and when the fish takes it, the spring releases, and it kind of fights the fish until you can get to it. And I thought that was the neatest thing. And you know, it's illegal to use that kind of stuff up here, but where he come from, I think it was Louisiana, if I recall correctly. He went into the whole spiel about how he grew up, and what happened for them is, again, it was, you know, a really poor time, and they didn't have no money at all, and there was absolutely no work to be had, and there was no government assistance or anything like that. So you either died or you found a way to live. And he told me about all the struggles they went through, and a lot of the fun they had too. They would set those zip reels up. They had hundreds of them. They'd set them up down the river, and they basically run a trap line with those zip reels every day. They spent their whole day getting those fish and cleaning them up and just doing basic chores or whatever, and goofing around too. They had a lot of spare time actually to goof around, and they would take those fish into town and trade them for basic necessities like flour, salt, sugar, material. His mom did all the sewing. She made their own clothes. They would buy the material, but she would make the clothes that they wore. And I just thought that was amazing. And they actually lived in a cave. He told me he was a caveman, and they found a cave down there, and that was their home. They lived in it, and to make their living, they bartered and traded those fish for the things they needed to live, until he moved up here and got a job working for the sand and gravel company. So that, you know, that story, and talking to him and being out fishing and stuff and hunting with him, you know, once again, you know, that just reinstilled that sense of self-reliance and not wanting to rely on others or be dependent on others for your survival, or for your livelihood for that matter. I think that's about it for family, because really, like I said, family's what got me into it, and I think those are some of the stories that hopefully can let you see into my mind and why I think the way I do, and why I'm attracted to bushcraft and survival and hunting and fishing. To me, it's kind of an all-encompassing subject. When you call it bushcraft, you're kind of including everything. I always liked woodworking. I've made, I make picnic tables and spring arbor benches and all that kind of stuff. And I made my own gun rack when I was in 7th grade out of white oak, which was a challenge because oak is a really hard wood to work. But it turned out nice, and when I got older, I made my own gun cabinet with, sliding glass doors and everything. I've always been into working with my hands, and especially working with wood. And then when I found out about bushcraft, I started carving spoons and forks and stuff like that out of basswood and cedar and such. And I don't know, that kind of just took me back to when I was a kid again. I remember living down south there. We lived in a little old coal mining village down in the holler, they called it. And there was this guy down the street that grew watermelons for a living. He had a big old field that he grew watermelons in, and all I ever remember seeing that guy do was out there working those watermelons. And when he wasn't doing that, he was sitting on his front porch, and he had a huge wooden chest that sat beside him. And he was always just sitting there whittling stuff. He'd whittle little figures and just anything you could imagine. He could whittle it up with a simple pocket knife and a piece of wood. And that old wooden chest was probably 3 foot by 4 foot by 2.5 foot high, and it was chock full of wood shavings from all his years of whittling. And carving those spoons and stuff just kind of takes me back to that. And I don't know, it just kind of puts me back in touch with my roots, I guess. But I didn't understand the term bushcraft until I read Morris Kochanski's book, Bushcraft. And it's a really good book. When I was a kid, even up into my 20s, the internet wasn't popular. There really was no such thing as the internet. There were bulletin boards and stuff, but the computers were slow, and there was no graphics of any kind or anything like that, what you have today. So I didn't get into computers because it seemed boring and slow. So I didn't have access to YouTube and all these online forums and stuff that talk about hunting and backpacking and hammocking and bushcraft and survival. All I had was the public library. I would go down there and I would check out books on wild plants, or check out some book about Indians and how they used to live, or a book on hunting or fishing. And I don't know, I have a real appreciation for that. I'm not the kind of person that likes to sit and read a book through, but I do like to kind of speed read and pick tidbits out. And if I find a good story, I'll read it through. But there's some good books out there on the subject. Morris Kochanski, his book Bushcraft is a really good one. John and Jerry McPherson, they have a couple books out, really, really good books. But to me, that's what bushcraft is. It's working with your hands and making the things you need to get by. Doing more with less. And other than my uncles doing the hunting and fishing, I didn't really have many people around that were into that kind of stuff. So once I found the internet, I remember the first forum I joined was a mushroom hunting forum, because I had went out on my own with a book that I had and identified an edible mushroom, the chicken of the woods mushroom. But I wanted to get some first-hand takes on it before I ate it. So I used my kid's computer and I went online searching, and I found there was a forum and you had to sign up, which I didn't want to do. But I did, and I talked to them, and they're like, yep, that's a chicken of the woods mushroom, sure enough. So I started participating in that forum, talking with everybody and sharing pictures and stuff of mushrooms. And then about 3 years after that, I I decided I wanted to, oh, crow flying overhead. I wanted to expand my knowledge about wild edibles into plants. So I, got a few books on wild edible plants. And once again, I found what I thought was a plant, but there's nobody locally for me to go to show them the plant to find out if it's what I think it is. So knowing that there's forums out there now, I started looking for plant forums. And what I found was a survival forum instead, but there was one guy on there who seemed quite into plants and seemed to have quite a bit of knowledge. So I went on there and was talking with him, and sure enough, I found out I had some edibles and started getting into the plants and berries and nuts and stuff. And then, of course, through that forum, I found out about survival and this term called bushcraft. So, of course, now that I'm computer literate, I've got the world at my fingertips, supposedly. I started searching around for survival and bushcraft forums, and found another survival forum and another bushcraft forum. And I saw on that bushcraft forum there was a lot of guys carving wood spoons and making bowls out of wood and just crafting all kinds of things, making their own cordage. I found an Aboriginal skills forum where people were napping their own arrowheads, and I'm like, oh wow, this is just awesome. I mean, this is what I want, this is what I've always wanted to do. But I just never knew anybody that was into it, and I had to rely on old outdated books from the public library to try and learn the stuff, and it's not very easy because a lot of those books were written by people that didn't even do the stuff. They just wrote a book and drew some half-ass pictures and expected you to figure out how to make a bow drill fire. But I did learn how to make the bow drill fire by reading John and Jerry McPherson's book. That was how I learned how to make the bow drill fire. And now let's see. I guess that's about it, really. I know I'm rambling on. I'm going to have to edit this video down, because I'm sure by now it's probably a good half hour long or more. I guess I'll skip on that and just tell you a little bit about me. I know Mr. Cornfed, he wanted to know what our username meant, and well, mine's pretty obvious. Or to me it was anyway. MI, meaning Michigan, wilderness. I'm out in the wilderness. That's what I do. I like to get out in the woods and hunt and gather and do bushcraft stuff. And the reason I picked that name, there is a reason, is I didn't want the channel to be about me per se. I wanted it to be about people getting out into the wilderness and and enjoying what nature has to offer, and the whole doing more with less self-reliance thing, really. But as far as me as a person, I had, my dad died when I was 5, and I was somewhat left, in a sense, to fend for myself, so I had to be self-reliant in that regard. I had to learn a lot of things the hard way, and I'm not going to go into all that. I wasn't very liked in school up here because I was a hillbilly, and I didn't hide it. And most of the people in my school were wannabe city types, and they just didn't like my kind of people. And I was poor, so I didn't have very good clothes, so I got picked on for having bad clothes and stuff. And goofy haircuts because my mom cut my hair. We couldn't afford to go to the barber and have our hair cut. But I managed to grow up, and I dropped out of school when I was 15. I went back to school when I was 18 and got my GED. through some bizarre miracle, I met a couple girls that were just short-term relationships. And then I met my wife about 11 years ago. And we were together for 8 years, and then we divorced because she had a serious gambling problem, and I just couldn't manage anymore, trying to pay all the debt from the gambling. So I separated based on that alone. We didn't have any kids together. She had 3 kids when I met her. We're still friends, and I still talk to her kids, and we do some hunting and stuff together too. But once I divorced, well, I really had a real hard time. About 4 years ago, I lost my job, I lost my wife, and I lost my house. Pretty much lost everything but my car and the clothes on my back and my guns. So, with the way the economy was, I'm the kind of person that has always been a hands-on worker. I've done just about every kind of job imaginable. I've done some construction, I've done some plumbing, heating and cooling. I did commercial and residential and industrial water treatment, refrigeration. I've done sales, residential sales and service. I worked for a Fortune 500 company for 5 years. I started out in production, and I worked my way up through team coordinator. I was the production coordinator for a team of about, 6 to 12 guys and girls. Personally didn't like that job because I was essentially the middleman between upper management and the production workers. I was the guy that had to go out and tell them that they were going to have to do more work and get less pay, and that just wasn't my cup of tea. So I went from there into customer service for that company, and I traveled abroad. I went to Brazil, I went to Mexico and did a lot of work. I trained their employees. I trained their engineers and stuff on the processes. I wrote processes. I was a quality assurance person, and I wrote the quality procedures and manuals. I did a lot of hands-on work and a lot of work with my brain too. I didn't really much care for the typing in that. I liked more working with people. I like the interaction with people. I really like the sales, except it's kind of a cutthroat thing doing sales for a living. But it was nice because I got to go out and meet lots of different people and basically just talk with them. But really the economy here sucks, and all those type of jobs that I had before, now, I'll be honest with you, either I'm not physically able to do them anymore like I was, or I just don't have the gumption like I was when I was 25. I used to be able to work 80, 90 hours a week, and it's hard for me to do that anymore and stay happy. So I decided to go back to school at the age of 39 or 40 years old and get a degree in software engineering, programming computers. I have one class left to finish that degree, and it was a real challenge. To be honest with you, I don't know if it's the kind of work I want to do, but I still think it was a really rewarding experience because it got me to, step outside from myself and the things I was comfortable with and move into something new. I like trying new things, and I like learning new things and figuring things out for myself. I fix my own car, I do my own taxes. If the washing machine breaks down or whatever, I figure out how to fix that and fix it too, if possible. We get a leaky pipe, I fix that. The roof leaks, I fix that. And now if my computer breaks down, I fix that. As much as it can possibly be fixed, because I think there's an inherent flaw with computers, and that's the fact that they're not fixable. But I'm just out here hunting. Figured I'd bring the old air rifle out since I was thinking back to my youth and that Daisy Red Ryder. I mean, this is a far cry from a Red Ryder. But it's a nice day. There's only about 8 days of hunting season left for squirrel, and I figured I'd get out here and do a little hunting and let you guys know a little bit about me. I've got 3 people that I need to tag to meet the Bushcrafter, and I'm gonna have to think about that. I sent some messages to a few people. I'm waiting for them to respond back, and when I get 3 people picked out that want to participate, because I don't want to single anybody out and make them feel they have to do something they don't want to do. When I find those 3 people, or however many people choose, 3 or less, I will post this video up and give you links to all their channels. Thanks for watching.